Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So I thought because of the Abraham Accords, um, which we see here, them signing the Abraham Accords. I'll watch just a quick 2-second video about it.
The Abraham Accord are ringing in a new era of Middle Eastern politics. On Tuesday, the 15th of September, UAE and Bahrain became the new Arab states to establish full diplomatic ties with Israel after 2 decades. Israel had earlier signed peace treaties with Egypt in 1979 and Jordan in 1994. The new agreement, penned in English, Arabic, and Hebrew, opens a new chapter for political, economic, and cultural relations. The 3 countries signed the 3 documents: the Abraham Accord, the Declaration of Peace, and the Treaty of Peace, diplomatic relations, and full normalization. The deal was brokered by US President Donald Trump, who remains optimistic that more Arab states will follow suit. While the attendees applauded the declaration,
So this was the declaration. We're all familiar with it right now, um, and it's extremely important for Israel right now that this was a major change that occurred. And so the question, so I figured that I wanted to do a book, talk about a book that I read, a very good book. It's a good book to read. Um, it's a long book, a very long book, and
landmarks.
it deals with how we got here in the first place. So the book is called Black Wave. Um, it's Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East, by Kim Gattis. What I didn't know what a black wave was, honestly. When I heard it, I was trying to say, like, what is a black wave? She doesn't explain. She doesn't say what a black wave is in the book. But what a black wave is an unbroken wave in deep waters that occurs before and after a storm at sea. The oncoming black wave informed the sailors known to beaten down the hatches, fair warning of the approaching storm. The black wave has changed. This change from in Iran, Saudi Arabia, or most of them Arab countries, where we assume that, like, there's been wars forever, that the way it is now it was forever, and it will be for the future. And a lot of what Israel is focusing on now, not was first with the Palestinians. We've seen where with Rabin, we saw there was a whole rush to make the Oslo Accords, and the idea to think that we would have some sort of peace where two lands would live side by side, and then even in the last election, there was nobody talking about that. There was arguments between Gantz and Netanyahu and on different parties and so on, but there was nobody really talking about, peace with the Palestinians. Wasn't like really a big issue. Wasn't a big issue in the thing. Yeah, maybe it's a couple of small parties, but really no. But the big parties weren't talking about it. The kind of idea that they have now is just trying to keep what's going on, the status quo more or less, and fighting against Iran and some of the other nations that are viewed as a threat to Israel. So I wanted to go through. So this book, it's a lot of the book itself has a lot um, of what's called interviews with various people. It covers 7 countries. She goes through different issues, women's rights in the country. She interviews individuals on things. But her overall goal is the following. She said she's trying to answer the following question: what happened to us? One second. What happened to us? The question haunts us in the Arab and Muslim worlds. Repeat it like a mantra. You will hear it from Iran to Syria, from Saudi Arabia to Pakistan, and in my own country of Lebanon. For us, the past is a different country, one that is not mirrored in the horrors of sectarian killings, a more vibrant place without the crushing intolerance of religious zealots and similarly endless and from wars. Through the past had coups and wars too. They were contained in time and space, and the future still held much promise. What happened to us? The question may not occur to those too young to remember a different world, or whose parents did not tell them of a youth spent reciting poetry and Peshawar, debating Marxism late into the night in the bars of Beirut, or riding bicycles to picnics on the banks of the Tigris River in Baghdad. The question may also surprise those in the West who assume that the extremism and the bloodletting of today were always the norm. And she goes on to say, trying to answer the question of what happened to us led me to the fateful year of 1979. Three major events took place in the same year, almost independent of one another: the Iranian Revolution, the siege of the Holy Mosque in Mecca by Saudi zealots, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The first battleground for jihad in modern times, and an effort supported by the United States. The combination of all three was toxic, and nothing was ever the same again. From this noxious brew was born the Saudi Iran rivalry, a destructive competition for leadership of the Muslim world in which both countries wield, exploit, and distort religion in more profane pursuit of raw power. That is the constant from 1979 onward, the torrent that flattens everything in its path. Now we're going to go look. I want to look at this question. First, I want to look at what happened. Really, we're going to analyze some 1979. What happened in Iran? What happened in Saudi Arabia? Give kind of background, some historical backgrounds of this thing, why this fight has occurred. I would like to take a look in this class as a shiur to see the Jewish viewpoint of some of the issues that are going on within this fight. Not the fight necessarily, the fight itself, which is a very political fight for power, but some of the things that's affecting the Arab people. More Arabs are killed. We talk about the Jews who are killed, but millions and millions of Arabs have been either killed or displaced, or really affected. Their lives were affected by what occurred, as she points out, in 1979 and onward. So I'd like to take a look at this thing. I think it's a very, very important topic, especially now that we have the Abraham Accords with Israel's making peace with a number of Arab nations. And we have to try to understand what are the dangers associated with this peace, because there are dangers associated with this peace going forward, and what Israel has to push to make sure that it keeps going in the right direction, as well as how does Judaism itself view these issues. So I'm going to do like one. I'm not going to watch this whole video, just a few minutes. Just want you to take a look at what Iran was like. We think Iran is the way it is today, right? It's they are executing people on the streets. It's anybody who speaks out against the regime is getting executed, or like we now had a second wrestler they announced that they're going to be executed because of him speaking out against the regime, and women have to be all covered up, and that's the view that we have of Iran. Let's take a look at Iran. This is a video from 1976 that I found. That this shows like what Iran was. Okay, so this is very much what she describes in the book, of that if you saw these videos, and I hid the term Iran, you would, and I said this was from 1976, you could easily say that this was an American city or a Western city, the way the women are dressed, the way people are acting. You don't see what you envision Iran to be now. And this was under the Shah. The Shah was very strong against shows of religion and so on in covering up. It's a lot of the things that you kind of see with Sisi today in Egypt, which is one of the things that Israel has to be very careful about. Sisi is a dictatorship, just like very much similar to the Shah. And so from an Israel point of view, things that happen within Iran are brewing within Egypt. We do see that. We do see that things that happen within Iran are brewing in Egypt. And the question is are we ready for such a thing? Because there is the pressure to attack, dissent, and so on. So in Iran at those days, it was very open. It was very modern. The relationship between, at this point, the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia was very nice, very good relationship. And Iran and Israel was a good relationship. And Iran and the United States was a good relationship. This is 1976. So, now, what happened in 1979? So we mentioned very briefly in her book, but she goes into much more detail. But there was a lot of things that happened in 1979. And I think it's very important for us to just take a quick look at 1979 of all these 11 things, 10 or 11 things, a few things, I think 10 things that affected, that really happened, that changed the world in 1979.
Saying that any one year in history was more significant in its contributions to the modern world than any other is a tall claim. After all, the past few centuries have seen their fair share of important years, and depending on a lot of factors, any one of them could be claimed to be more important than another. While we agree with that line of reasoning, there is one year that directly shaped today's geopolitics and society unlike any other: 1979. From pivotal strides in technology to massive shifts in political currents across the world, shifts that still affect global relations today, here are 10 ways the year 1979 made the modern world. Number 10. The Iran Revolution. The year 1979 brought massive changes to the Middle East, though no event compares to the Iranian Revolution in terms of the scale of its impact. What started out as a genuinely good people's revolution based on the ideas of liberty and democracy was eventually subverted by Islamic fundamentalists, giving way to the Islamic Republic of Iran that we know of today. The rise of Iran was also the revival of Shia Islam, and its role in making the Middle East what it is today cannot be understated. It wasn't just a rise of powerful and brutal Shia militias within Iran like Hezbollah, but also militias across the region who'd go on to play a crucial role in the upcoming war against Iraq, as well as every other war in the region since then. Iran, along with its allies and Russia, is currently winning the Syrian civil war, not because it's a particularly powerful country, but because of the soft power it wields through its militia networks across the Middle East. Their fighting forces are nothing to laugh at either, which would probably not have happened if not for the events of 1979. Thanks to Iran, Shias are now a powerful and rather dominating fighting force in the region, which is one of the few reasons why the sectarian conflict is still ongoing. Number 9. Margaret Thatcher. Much like the rest of the world in 1979, Britain was going through profound changes. Now that the golden boom of the early post-war period was over, discontent and unemployment were as high as ever. James Callaghan's Labour government was facing a spat of paralysing union strikes across the country and was promptly voted out in 1979. He was replaced by Margaret Thatcher, whose policies were so influential that we still don't have a full measure of their impact on the world. Her belief in free trade, minimum government interference, individualism, tax cuts for the wealthy, and environmental laws would serve as a blueprint for successful conservative and neoliberal movements around the world. A most important role, however, was in permanently stifling the global south for the foreseeable future. Because of her and Ronald Reagan's persistence and influence in the IMF and World Bank, many impoverished nations under debt were forced to liberalize their economies in exchange for the necessary bailouts. Known as Structural Adjustment Programs, SAPs, these initiatives have caused a deluge of problems for the countries involved. The massive income inequality, weakening of social welfare programs, and rise in conflict in many of these regions we see today is directly because of the implementation of the policies required by those SAPs. Number 8, the fall of communism. Many of us remember the fall of the Soviet Union as a clear marker for the fall of communism. That could be true for its geographical influence, though its fall as a popular belief system had begun much earlier. Much like its victory, communism's defeat was more ideological than geopolitical. While the changes were gradual, many historians agree that the end of communism was marked by John Paul II's 1979 visit to his homeland, Poland. It worked as a spark for the disgruntled and repressed population of the Polish People's Republic, the biggest communist state of the time after the Soviet Union. The various people-led committees formed during and after his encouraging visit would go on to form the Solidarity Movement, which later would overthrow the communist government in 1989. His visit also massively encouraged the people in other communist states to speak up, and some historians even say that many of Gorbachev's policies that eventually led to the fall of the Soviet Union were inspired by the Solidarity Movement. Number 7, the Charney Report. For many people, climate change came out of nowhere. Here we were, going to the beaches in the summer and generally enjoying a planet with a regular climate pattern, and suddenly the whole of Australia is on fire. While it may have come as a surprise to many of us, scientists have been saying pretty much the same thing since their first report, which happened to have come out in 1979. Known as the Charney Report, it was the first time a bunch of scientists sat down, did some calculations, and agreed that greenhouse gases, like CO2, may not be entirely good for the planet. It was also the first time someone precisely predicted the rise in temperatures about to happen in the following years. While it did little to sway the general public's mood, it mobilized the science and research community and directly led to the development of many technologies we now use to monitor climate trends. Moreover, its predictions have been accurate in all the years since it was written, proving, if nothing else, that scientists know what they're talking about. Number 6, the Nicaraguan Revolution. South and Central American countries are no strangers to revolutions of all kinds, though the Nicaraguan Revolution in 1979 stands out for its impact on the future of the region. Fought between the Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN, and the ruling Somoza Party, the brutal civil war set off a chain of events that shaped the political landscape of South America, as well as set the stage for all of the violent uprisings and crackdowns of the following decades. The war was initially won by the Sandinistas, though the communist nature didn't sit too well with the American interests in the region. Mexico, on the other hand, supported the revolutionary regime, and its military aid to the government in Nicaragua and other rebels in the region further destabilized it. FSLN's war with American-trained Contras, locally trained fighters including pro-Somoza factions, would affect politics in neighboring regions for years to come. Number 5. The Walkman. In a year of political turmoil and civil unrest around the world, Japan of 1979 was going through a different kind of revolution. It was a time when Japanese companies were ruling the world of technology, from gaming to household appliances. While many products of the time could be called path-breaking, one of them changed the modern world as unlike any other: the Sony Walkman. It may have been made defunct by mobile phones literally being full-fledged computers these days, but the Walkman's release in Japan on July 1st, 1979 marked the beginning of a long era we simply had never seen before. For the first time in history, people could listen to recorded music on the go, something that had never been possible before. The popularity of the Walkman also fueled the cassette industry, giving way to giant music studios that still exist today. Number 4, the rise of Wahhabism. If so many of these events seem to be from the Middle East, it's because the year 1979 has been particularly inauspicious for that region. This one happens in Saudi Arabia, when a group of armed militants storms the Grand Mosque in Mecca. They demanded the ouster of the monarchy and called for a people's revolution, though unlike Iran, they massively misjudged popular sentiment on the matter. In a battle that went on for weeks, the rebels, along with civilian hostages, were eventually defeated. The incident, the first of its kind, shocked the Islamic world and caused monumental shifts in the Saudi regime. It caused the king to invoke an even stricter form of Sharia across the Arab world, which gave way to the rise of a radical, militant form of Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia and its nearby allies. Militant Islam, originating out of Saudi Arabia and its allies, has caused some of the most far-reaching events of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, like the fall of the USSR and 9/11. Number 3. Recognition of China. As historians have noted time and time again, 20th century American governments had a particularly huge problem with communist regimes. The US had dealt with any new nation formed after a revolution like any level-headed nation would, by either literally going there to change their leader or just refusing to acknowledge it until it ceases to exist. It hasn't worked that well with bigger nations, though, like China. While it had initially refused to recognize the communist Chinese government, a trade partner as big as China has really never hurt anyone. On January 1st, 1979, the USA recognized the People's Republic of China as a nation. That decision, combined with the liberalizing reforms of the newly elected Deng Xiaoping, led to China turning into arguably the most advanced and rapidly developing nation of today. American recognition was soon followed by China formally entering the global market, setting the stage for its ascent to its current place in the world. Number 2. Saddam Hussein seizes power. Saudi Arabia and Iran weren't the only Middle Eastern nations going through massive political and social changes in 1979. Iraq, a major military power in the region at the time and a backdrop of unimaginable violence in the following decades, was going through its own changes, starting with Saddam Hussein seizing the president's chair. The first thing he did was to violently suppress all opposition, as well as ally with extremist Sunni factions to oppose Iran's growing influence. While it may not have been a Shia-Sunni conflict at the time, Saddam's support for extremism to achieve political goals would have permanent ramifications for the region in the long term. However, that doesn't mean there weren't immediate repercussions too. Soon after his election, Saddam dragged his country into a long, drawn-out war with Iran. Most of us may not be aware it even happened, though it was one of the longest and bloodiest wars in history, and went on for about 8 years. The war, along with the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, permanently set the region up for a much more violent confrontation in the future, which came in the form of the Syrian civil war. Number 1. USSR invades Afghanistan. While there may have been many important events in the 20th century, some, like the World Wars and Russian Revolution, stand out for the sheer gravity of their impact. One of those was the misguided Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The war, which started out on a successful note, would eventually bankrupt the USSR, end the Cold War, give birth to the modern idea of militant jihadism, and make leaders like Osama bin Laden. It's not a very oft-discussed fact, though Soviets were eventually repelled by extremist Islamic factions armed and trained by the US, often through Pakistan or China. The Islamic fundamentalism so many countries are trying to fight today was initially promoted and encouraged to serve the strategic goal of opposing Soviet influence in that war. While it may have overserved that goal, as the war ended up ruining the Soviets, we're not sure if the trade-off was worth it. The decade-long Soviet invasion of Afghanistan changed the world in more ways than we could count, or perhaps even know of. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit the...
Oh, sorry. So you see, 1979 was a very important year in the world. So at this point, we just watched this long video. One of the things that
Saying that any one year in history was...
before I go there, I know we just watched a lot of video. I'm not going to go to this one yet. I'll come back to this one when we go to a little bit of a shear. I do want to discuss what is the difference between Sunnis and Shiites, because I think that people don't understand that the difference, where it comes from. How long is this video? I think this video is actually, maybe we'll just do this quickly. I think this is only a 2-minute video. But I just explained what is the difference between Sunnis and Shiites and why are they fighting? I'm not sure everybody understands why they're fighting, why they hate each other so much. So maybe we'll just quickly watch this video and then we'll get into the sheer portion.
When we watch the news and see reporters talking about the conflicts that are playing out across the Middle East, we hear a lot about fighting between the Sunnis and the Shiites, the two main sects of Islam. But many of us have no idea what the difference between the two groups is and why there is so much friction between them. So let's take a look at some of the history and the geopolitics to get a sense of what is really going on. There are 1.6 billion Muslims across the world. Roughly 85% of them are Sunnis. The division began after the death of the Prophet Muhammad some 1400 years ago as a disagreement about who should succeed him. The Sunnis felt that Abu Bakr, a close friend of the Prophet's, ought to be the next Muslim leader. But the Shiites claimed that Muhammad had anointed his son-in-law Ali as rightful successor. The Sunnis won out, but a split was born, and that rift was cemented when Ali's son was later killed by the ruling Sunni troops, an event which the Shiites commemorate every year. Fast forward more than 1,000 years, and the situation is worse than ever. According to a poll by Pew Research, some 40% of Sunnis don't even regard Shiites as real Muslims. But there's more than theology at work here. Perhaps even more important is geography. 100 years ago, around the time of the First World War, the Middle East was carved up in a Franco-British pact called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But the Europeans had little interest in understanding the religious and ethnic intricacies of the Middle East when they divided up the region. Still, these arbitrary borders became the blueprint for today's map. The Shiites were divided primarily among Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon, with an offshoot of Shia Islam, the Alawites, in Syria. This area has come to be known as the Shia Crescent. Sunni Muslims make up the bulk of the population of other countries in the region, with pockets of Shiites scattered among them. As you might expect, problems arise in countries where both sects are vying for power or one group feels oppressed. In Syria, for example, a Sunni majority has been ruled for the last 45 years by an Alawite minority. In Iraq, a Sunni minority ruled over the Shiite majority for decades. After the U.S. invasion, Saddam Hussein, a Sunni, was overthrown and a Shiite government took over. That government proceeded to marginalize the Sunnis, and now some of those disenfranchised Sunnis have gone on to form the so-called Islamic State, or ISIS. Now let's do a quick who's who in the Middle East. As you've just heard, ISIS, along with al-Qaeda, are Sunni groups. Hezbollah is Shiite. Osama bin Laden was a Sunni. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is an Alawite. Remember, that's a Shiite sect. And the Iranian mullahs are Shiites as well, which helps explain why Iran has gotten involved in the conflict in Syria. And where does America stand in all this? Traditionally, the U.S.'s strongest allies in the region have been Sunni powers, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. But now the U.S. is pursuing a nuclear deal with Shiite Iran and is working alongside Shiites in Iraq to try to destroy ISIS. But at the same time, Washington still supports Saudi Arabia, which is currently bombing Iranian-backed Shiite rebels in Yemen. Confused yet? One satirist summarized the tangled web of conflicting relationships with this map. So what can we conclude? At the end of the day, it's important to remember that the majority of ordinary Sunnis and Shiites do not hate each other, and both groups share the same core tenets of Islam. In a sense, it's similar to the differences between, say, the Catholics and the Protestants. And the fighting and the bloodshed that we're seeing across the region are less about religion than they are about power.
And that's
When we
very
watch
much
the news and see
that's very much the case. It's much more about power than it is in anything else. Although they do have a very interesting, it was an award-winning, very short film you could see in we may have to we're going to get kicked off in 10 minutes, so then just come back right on if we do. Sorry about that. There was an award-winning film that says that shows two like just kids arguing. They're on a bench and they're whatever they're arguing over which one is the real one. Is it Shia or is it Sunni or Shia? And they're screaming at each other. It's just like teenage kids. But anyway, you see how how deep it goes. Actually, this machlokes. So I wanted to talk to bring some Torah into this as well, and look at the Jewish view of it. One of the things that you see is the insistence on um, following the path, right? Whatever the path is, if it's Shia or Sunni. But within the Iranian Revolution, we saw there's a radicalism that has taken hold, and it's in hold and within a lot of the modern Arab world today, as opposed to what she points out in the book in Black Wave, how it wasn't the case, that it was a much more modern society, not necessarily modern where they didn't have women who would cover up. So she said, what she said is that women chose to cover up, but it was their choice. In the past, it was their choice, and now it's not their choice, because if you don't, you're either canceled or executed or disappeared. A lot of people just disappear, and they don't know what happened to those people. And she talks a lot about that, how the people just go, and there was a big fear of the of families that what happened to those individuals who just go away. The Gemara has many different accounts showing the importance of individual thought within Judaism, and even the ability of screaming when you feel something is wrong. So the Gemara in Tanis tells us, "Amar of Chama Chanina Mai Dichsiv Barzal Barzal Yachad." Lomer Lacha Ma Barzal Zeh Echad Mechoded Es Chavero. That when you have two people screaming at each other, taking different positions and yelling and fighting each other, that's what makes you strong. The Gemara tells the story in Baba Metzia of Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan, how when Reish Lakish died, so they tried to get a chavrusa for Rav Yochanan, and every time he came up with an idea, all these chavrusas would give 1,000 proofs on why he was right, and it depressed him. He said, "What are you giving me 1,000 proofs for right? I need 1,000 proofs. Reish Lakish would give me 1,000 proofs why I was wrong. That's what made me sharp. I want to fight about it. I want to know what the truth is. I don't want to be a yes man. I don't want a yes man. I want to have somebody tell me when I am wrong, and so I could get to the real truth." The Gemara tells us in Brachos that it says, so there's a bracha that we say when you see people, when you see large amounts of people, Baruch Hachama Harazim, that she'ein datem domeh, that the Torah realizes that 3 Jews, 4 opinions, that every Jew has their own opinion, that Israel's run by everybody's a prime minister, everybody knows how to run the country, right? And that's a good thing. That's why we say a special bracha, that Hashem knows, that that we appreciate the difference that we have within each other, that everybody has different thoughts. Here, the Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin that when it came to prophecy, even that each prophet would have, even if the message was the same, even if it was the same message, that they had different styles, and each style, sometimes you could speak to one person, Shnei Neviim mitnabin besignon echad, that there's not 2 prophets that have the same signon, same style of giving something over. So maybe I could hear the idea from you, but where I couldn't hear it from somebody else. It's like, sometimes you hear the same idea over and over and over, and you're like, okay. And then somebody gives you a mashal, somebody says it in a way, and you go, I get it now. Like, now I get it. That's what a good teacher is. A good teacher is somebody who understands the different learning styles, who understands how to reach different people through different methods. Some people are very auditory learners. Some people are need visual learners. Some people need to do the thing before they could learn. Some people need quiet. Some people need noise. It's very, very different. Everybody's a different individual. We celebrate those differences, and therefore, even the Nevi'im, even though they may have said the same messages, but they did it in a different style. So therefore, the Torah celebrates that fact. the Sforno has a very beautiful parish on Noach. So he says, so it says the same word that echad twice. It talks about how their oneness. It's talking about the oneness, and so Sforno points out here that Hashem had the choice. Either everybody, the society was supposed to be like one society. Everybody, kind of like what you see here in what was speaking out against. You speak out against the government, all of a sudden you disappear. You get killed, right? You get thrown off the tower. So the choice was to have one society where everybody believes the same thing, or to have various opinions where everybody could think for themselves. And Hashem wanted where everybody could think for themselves. He said, even if we had, let's say, an Avodah Zarah, right? Everybody would follow the Avodah Zarah. How could we ever have an Avram in a world where there's dictatorship? So Hashem had to break up the dictatorship in order for the world to be able to have an Avram eventually. And that's what it says. It says that how does we get the word? How does Avram get the idea? We're called Ivrim. How come we're called Ivrim? From so Kol Olam Kulo Me'ever Echad V'hu Me'ever Echad. That Avram was, everybody in the world had one opinion, and Avram was able to see something that nobody else in the world could see. So we see here the beauty of individual thought, that the Torah pushes individual thought. And that's what we push our kids. I mentioned this when I would speak about Judaism every once in a while in my school. They asked me to give a class on Judaism. And I say, the one thing is we want kids to challenge the religion. We want them to ask the hard questions. And not only that, we give them the question. We feed them the questions. So they should know that it's okay to ask, and that this is something that they should struggle with. And maybe we don't have the answer for them. But on Pesach, we sit and we have the hard question: how could God do this? Tisha B'Av, we say, how could God do this? So it's terrible. We allow the questioning of God, even, and a questioning of religion. Okay, but we have a question. We see that the Torah tells us that it's not 100% true, right? That this says that we have one halacha. So it says that what we should have is that there should be one halacha for everybody, right? That when the what's called when the sorry, lost this. When the with the Torah and Devarim tells us that we have second, I lost this. Okay, that we have one thing that it says. Levilti rom levavo me'achav, levilti sora min hamitzvos yaminu small. You're not allowed to go even left or right. Laman yarich yamim al malachto b'vanav v'karav Yisrael. Right? You can't go against even left or right. And the Rambam points out that if somebody, so they have this thing called zakan mamre, somebody who goes against Jews. So how does it work that we have a sense of how do you differentiate? How come we have to keep, in one way it says that we have this individual thought, and the other way it says you're not allowed, you could get executed if you go against the halacha. So the Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us, I thought I had it here. So the Gemara, basically, the outcome is that it says that the way the Sanhedrin worked is that they would sit the Sanhedrin around, and they would be able to argue one to another. They'd state the lowest opinion, so they shouldn't be overwhelmed by the more experienced judges. Everybody was allowed to state their fact, and they could argue and argue and argue and argue and argue. However, once we come to a consensus as a people, you can't go against the consensus. The rest, we have nothing. Then we just have a million different fractions. So it's okay for people to disagree in thought, but we have to have a certain practice that people follow in order to have a religion, in order to have laws. So once we agree on the laws that this is what the Torah tells us, and this is what the laws that we're going to follow, this is the rabbis, this is the interpretation of the laws. Once we understand those facts, then you have to keep to those laws, or else there's punishments like any other thing that we have. It's not like in America. See, we have laws from the Torah that Hashem gave us, so that those are the laws we have. But even laws that the rabbis have all agree upon, it's no different than in America, where we say 55. If you go over 55, you could get a fine, or you could even go to jail. If you go 100 miles an hour, they'll say that's crazy driving. They could put you in jail for that, right? Especially it's dangerous to other people there, so they could put you in jail. So what gives them the right to do that? Well, it's just made up. Yeah, it's made up, but it's something that's agreed upon by the people who voted and so on. So that law is in place, and therefore, once we have that law, we have to keep to it. Okay, so that the difference between what we see in the Muslim world here in these cases, I'm not saying all the Muslim world, but in these cases that she's mentioning in the book, is that that in a dictatorship, it's very important to have what we're going to call what Sharansky calls doublethink, and we'll talk about that in Sharansky's book. But he goes into big depth on how dictatorships work and how they stay into power. But here we see in Iran how we're going to see when they came to power, the first thing they did is kill off all the people who went against the government. Now we have to see that this was not something that it's something that happened quick, but it was something that really took the people by surprise. Nobody expected that. They thought that, and she really spends a lot of time in the book on this, is they thought that, like, he didn't, it's like Hitler. It was really like Hitler, like he said these crazy things, but he didn't really mean it. And once he got in power, the level-headed people, they'll keep Khomeini, in check, but he wasn't. And he went on a rampage and he killed all his people. So let's go see what actually happened in Iran. Then I want to see what happened from Iran towards the rest of the Arab world and how that friction occurs. And then we'll end off talking about maybe a little bit how it affects Israel, and the end off the share there.
40 years ago, Shiite Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini spearheaded a revolution that deposed the monarchy in Iran. In its place arose an Islamic republic. A repressive theocracy had replaced an authoritarian monarchy. And almost overnight, Iran had been transformed from a crucial US ally into a bitter opponent. Here are some of the key dates that led to the revolution. From 1941 to 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, a close partner of the United States, had ruled Iran. He modernized Iran while forcefully suppressing dissent and political freedoms. The clergy opposed the Shah's social and economic reforms. Discontent grew until in 1978, anti-Shah demonstration spread across the mostly Shia country. Strikes and mass protests erupted, and accusation flew that the Shah was the US puppet. Martial law was imposed. Cassette tapes of speeches by the 76-year-old Khomeini were smuggled into the country, fueling the unrest. Many Iranians took to the rooftops at night to shout Allahu Akbar, or God is great, to express their protest. On January 16, 1979, the Shah left Iran for what was officially a vacation. Many Iranians rejoiced with chants of "The Shah is gone." The man who'd ruled the country for 37 years would never return from exile, dying some 13 months later. On February 1st, a crowd of around 3 million people in Tehran welcomed Khomeini's return from 14 years of exile. Asked about his feelings, the Islamic revivalist famously gave a cryptic one-word answer: nothing. Finally, on February 11th, the revolutionaries declared victory after Iran's demoralized armed forces declared neutrality. The monarchy was suddenly gone. Deadly factionalism followed, but Khomeini held the upper hand. And in April, following a nationwide referendum, an Islamic Republic was officially proclaimed, eventually with Khomeini at its apex. Thousands of Shah-era officials and other Iranians would be executed following summary trials. Student revolutionaries would storm the US embassy, taking dozens hostage. Tehran would doggedly pursue anti-Western policies for decades to come. The revolution's 40th anniversary arrives at a critical juncture for the Islamic Republic, hobbled by US sanctions, infighting, and the frustration of a restless young populace, most of whom were born after the revolution. Some regime insiders have warned recently that the Islamic establishment could collapse. Even one of Khomeini's own grandsons warns there's no guarantee that this system his grandfather created would survive. Despite such speculation, it is clear that the clerical establishment remains firmly in place.
Now, what she points out in the book is that although, yes, she wants to try to show hope that there is a change in the future of the kids being frustrated by a lack of economic progress and focus on the bomb, which she says is such a pride at this point that there's no point in she was very critical of the of Obama. She's very critical of Obama in general, but very critical of Obama in the deal, the Iranian deal. She felt also was a big mistake. She's critical of Obama. She said that that he views that Shia and Sunnis will always be at war, and she says it wasn't the case. That it really was historically that they were together and they did support each other. So Iran we see as being prepped up by China and Russia and other groups that allow it to flourish to at least survive during these sanctions.
40 years ago, Shiite Ayatollah.
I'm not going to go through this because of just the time. We don't have time. You can watch this when I send out the thing if you're interested, or you can look it up on YouTube. It's a history. It's very fascinating on how 1979 we saw brought Saddam Hussein to power and his fight against Khomeini. It's very interesting in the book. She goes through Arafat and Khomeini. So when Khomeini first comes, Arafat was a big supporter of Khomeini, right? Because he thought that this was going to be this was everything that he was looking for. He flies in and meets with him. Khomeini used the Israel-Palestinian fight to gather, just like, they needed a scapegoat. That was the Jews were the scapegoat once again. She points that out in the book a lot. And she said that he really hated Arafat. He felt it was a corrupt leader, which he was. He married, he married a Christian woman. I didn't actually know that at the time, but I learned it from this book. And he was disgusted by Arafat. He didn't want anything to do with Arafat. He just used Arafat to gain the thing. And then he tried to drop them as soon as possible. He felt that there was no future with Arafat. Plus, Khomeini wanted to be the complete dictator of the Arab world. And that's why he sent millions of people to their deaths in this Iran-Iraq war, which went on again for 8 years and cost so many lives, all with just a fight for power between Saddam Hussein and Khomeini.
By the end of the 1970s, Iran and Iraq eyed each other warily, and they would.
So the last thing we'll just talk about, I guess we are also really out of time, is Saudi Arabia versus Iran. These are two major powers who are looking for, and what she points out in the book are they're very, very similar in their way they use power. She says in the book, she talks about how in Saudi Arabia, they now allow women to drive. However, all the women who fought for the right to drive are all in jail. He said, because why? Because they fought for the right to drive, but the monarchy wanted to show that they're the ones who, in their their magnanimous ways, are allowing the women to drive. What she points out is that Saudi Arabia is very much a dictatorship, no different than Iran. It is closer to Israel and America because of the threat of Iran, she feels, and also they're fighting over holy places and so on. There's a major just power struggle between these two empires. It's a very good video to watch to really understand this conflict in
Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Sorry. So the difference, I think, in Judaism, and now we'll just tie it back into Israel and to Judaism. In Judaism, we believe in the concept when you save one life, it's as if you saved the entire world. You know, when in Israel, when Rabin, well, now this is a terrible thing, a Jewish person killed the head of the Jewish people, but it's not only that, it's just when was the last time that you could think of? I was trying to think of other instances that wasn't Rabin, where a Jew kills another Jew, you know, for political reasons or for whatever. I was trying to figure it out. It's hard for me to remember a case. I couldn't think of any cases. I did some searches. I couldn't remember a case where Jews will kill another Jew. We might scream at each other. We might be mean to each other, but for the most part, you know, it would make big news if it happens, if God forbid such a thing happens, because we believe so much in the sanctity of life that it's more important than even any political gains. Now, yes, there was the time, you know, when the Antalya, there was some certain things where, you know, the Jews had civil wars, and we have definitely in Tanakh, and we had, you know, Menachem Begin when they came out against him and so on. They felt that they were Rodefs and so on. But for the most part, it's very, very rare that you have a case where Jews do this, even for political things. We could argue, yell, and scream, and try to give money to political parties and so on. But we still always come back to when you save a life, it's as if you save the entire world, and that we're all, you know, brothers and sisters at the end of the day. So where does this lead the Jewish people? Well, we're stuck in a very Israel is stuck in a very difficult situation. You have this, in some ways a crumbling Arab world that's now focusing on weapons, as we see. They're focusing on computer warfare, trying to steal secrets, trying to steal stuff. They were not educated in the sense of open education, and therefore they don't have the innovations that the rest of the world that have, even China with all their innovations, even though it's communism, but they have a tremendous amount of innovation and money being put into, you know, from China. So and across the world, so the Arabs have always relied on the oil that they had, but now that's, you know, coming to an end as energy is changing, and the use of oil is changing within the world. More countries have it, like America is the biggest exporter of oil now, of natural gas and oil. So with fracking, due to fracking, so all these things have changed the landscape. And the question, and it's dangerous in the Middle East. It's always been a dangerous neighborhood, but it's dangerous in the Middle East as people have more, you know, as people are more desperate for things with Syria being Syrians spread out all over the place. It became much more dangerous within Europe and other places. So these are things, this goes back to this particular time in 1979, and some of the lessons that we should learn from these lessons of supporting somebody like the Shah, who America and Israel and everybody supported because they were very good, but because he was oppressive to his people, they rebelled in a way that now we're paying for it as well. So these are things that you know, we should think about as we go forward with other nations. There's so much more to say on this. There's so many more things. I spent a lot of time on this, but okay, I hope you enjoy. I hope it was just a taste of what's going on today in the Arab world.